Two people were wounded this week when an American strike hit a residential neighborhood inside Bandar Abbas, a place called Tappeh Allah Akbar, sitting inside the exact city Iran has spent decades treating as its most protected military stronghold. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even close to the first time. Since March of this year, Bandar Abbas has been hit again, and hit repeatedly through multiple separate waves of this war across nearly 5 months of sustained military pressure. And each time, the same basic question keeps resurfacing. If Iran's most important naval city, the headquarters of its entire fleet, the gateway to the Strait of Hormuz itself, can be reached this many times, this consistently, what exactly was Iran's plan for actually defending it? Tonight, we're going to walk through the full history of what's happened to this single city since this war began, why it keeps getting targeted again and again, and why the most recent strategy being used against it might be the most consequential one yet. If you've been tracking this war through scattered individual headlines, you've been missing the full arc of what's happened to this one specific location. And that arc tells you more about the actual state of Iran's military position than almost any other single story in this entire conflict. Subscribe now, because tonight we're building the complete picture, from the first fires in March through the most recent strike just days ago. Here's my thesis, laid out plainly before I prove it to you. Bandar Abbas was never actually safe at any point in this war, despite functioning as Iran's most significant naval headquarters and its primary military anchor along the Strait of Hormuz. What's changed over the past 5 months isn't whether this city can be reached. That question was answered in March. What's changed is the strategy behind why it keeps being targeted, evolving from direct strikes on military assets sitting inside the port toward a deliberate, methodical campaign to isolate the entire city from the rest of the country, cutting the roads and bridges that connect it to Tehran itself. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why that specific shift in strategy might matter more than any single explosion. Let's go back to where this story actually starts, because understanding the full arc requires seeing where the first cracks in Bandar Abbas's supposed security actually appeared. On March the 2nd of this year, satellite images released by the commercial imaging company Planet Labs showed fires burning and vast plumes of black smoke rising directly from Iran's main naval headquarters at Bandar Abbas, with at least one vessel confirmed ablaze following a direct strike. Those images arrived within days of the United States and Israel launching a coordinated wave of targeted strikes against Iran during the earlier phase of this broader conflict known as Operation Epic Fury. According to maritime intelligence firm Windward AI, monitoring the situation in real time, the port of Bandar Abbas was experiencing multiple active fires simultaneously, including one aboard a vessel actually berthed at the port itself, with 3 distinct fire locations confirmed, 2 at port infrastructure facilities, and 1 directly involving a docked vessel. Here's the detail that made that specific March strike so significant. According to Fox News reporting at the time, the damaged vessel was consistent with the Iranian Navy's Makran-class forward-based ship, a specialized, purpose-built military vessel, not a civilian or commercial asset caught in the crossfire. This was a direct hit on genuine Iranian naval capability, sitting inside the port that serves as the headquarters for that Navy's entire operational structure. Windward AI's assessment at the time was carefully worded but genuinely significant, noting that despite the visible fires, 17 military vessels and 5 commercial ships remained docked at the port, a continued military concentration that the firm suggested indicated a heightened defensive posture rather than an evacuation. In other words, even after watching its own naval headquarters catch fire on live satellite imagery, Iran's military chose to keep the bulk of its fleet stationed there rather than dispersing it elsewhere. That decision, keeping the fleet concentrated at Bandar Abbas, even after its own vulnerability had just been demonstrated in the most public way possible, tells you something important about the strategic bet Iran was making from the very beginning of this conflict. This port was too important to abandon, too central to Iran's entire naval posture along the Strait of Hormuz, to simply disperse in response to a single wave of strikes, however damaging those strikes had actually been. Like and subscribe right now, because what's happened to this exact city in the months since that first March strike tells you exactly how that specific bet has actually played out. Let's fast forward through the pattern that's developed since then, because Bandar Abbas has not simply absorbed one significant strike and then faded from this war's target list. It has remained one of the most consistently, repeatedly struck locations across the entire conflict. Just over a week ago, following the deaths of 3 American soldiers in separate Iranian attacks, the United States launched a fresh, significant round of military strikes directly against Iran, and Bandar Abbas was explicitly named among the primary targets, alongside the port city of Chabahar. U.S. Central Command confirmed this specific operation had been launched under direct orders from the Commander-in-Chief, with the stated objective of degrading Iran's capacity to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's own state television confirmed an explosion in Bandar Abbas almost immediately after CENTCOM's announcement went public, specifically describing the city as Iran's strategic port, home to key naval facilities directly overlooking the strait itself. That strike triggered an immediate Iranian response, with the Revolutionary Guard's own Sepah news outlet claiming 3 separate waves of missile and drone strikes against American military assets in Bahrain. And Kuwait, describing the operation as direct retaliation for the American strikes on Iranian territory that had just hit Bandar Abbas. Iran's regular army separately claimed responsibility for striking American HIMARS missile systems at Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, describing that specific action as the 18th phase of what it called its ongoing Thunder military operation. And then, just 3 days ago, it happened again. Iranian state media reported that a fresh American strike had hit the Tappeh Allah Akbar neighborhood inside Bandar Abbas directly, wounding 2 people according to a provincial official, with emergency response teams deployed to the scene in the immediate aftermath. That same reporting confirmed additional explosions had been heard elsewhere across Iran that same day. And separately, further strikes were also reported around the areas of Omidyeh and Andameshk, both located in the country's southwest. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If a single city has now been struck this many separate times, across this many separate waves of this war, spanning from March all the way through this past week, at what point does the pattern itself stop being newsworthy purely because of another individual strike, and start being newsworthy because of the sheer, sustained persistence of a target that Iran has apparently never been able to fully protect, defend, or relocate away from, across nearly 5 months of continuous conflict? Subscribe now, because the strategy behind these strikes has actually evolved significantly over these past several months, and the most recent phase of that evolution is genuinely more strategically significant than the earlier direct hits on the port itself. Let's talk about the bridges, because this is the part of the story that represents a genuine, deliberate shift in how the United States has been approaching this specific city, and it deserves careful, direct attention. According to detailed reporting on the expanding scope of this campaign, the United States specifically struck highway and railway bridges surrounding Bandar Abbas in strikes that appeared deliberately aimed at cutting off the city, Iran's main port, from the roads leading directly toward Tehran, the capital. Think about what that specific targeting choice actually represents strategically. This isn't simply another strike on a naval facility or a military asset sitting inside the port itself. This is a calculated effort to sever the physical, logistical connection between Iran's most important port city and the rest of the country, specifically the capital. While other routes reportedly remain open, meaning this isn't yet a complete, total isolation of the city, the reporting was explicit that these strikes could expand further, potentially disrupting both the movement of military material specifically and the broader flow of goods needed to sustain Iran's population of roughly 90 million people. That distinction, disrupting military logistics, specifically versus disrupting the broader civilian supply chain that an entire nation depends on, is exactly the kind of strategic tension that's been running throughout this entire war. And this bridge campaign around Bandar Abbas puts that tension into extremely sharp, concrete focus. Iran itself directly acknowledged the seriousness of this specific dimension of the campaign for the first time this past week, confirming attacks on power infrastructure during the American airstrikes, with the country's energy ministry specifically asking residents across the southern provinces to reduce their electricity usage, according to the state news agency ISNA. That's not a minor administrative announcement. That's a national government formally asking a significant portion of its own population to actively ration electricity, a direct, tangible, civilian consequence of a military campaign that officially remains focused on degrading purely military and maritime capability. Here's the detail from the same wave of strikes that adds an entirely separate dimension to the story. The same operational wave that hit the bridges around Bandar Abbas also damaged a maritime control tower in Chabahar, a separate port located along the Gulf of Oman, technically outside the Strait of Hormuz itself, but functioning as a major port jointly operated with India. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth personally posted an image directly to social media showing that specific tower collapsing in real time, with plumes of smoke rising around it as the strike unfolded. CENTCOM's own public statement accompanying this wave of strikes was direct and specific, stating the United States continues to hold Iran accountable at the commander-in-chief's direction, while fully enforcing a naval blockade against Iranian ports. The reporting characterized this latest expansion of the campaign as appearing specifically targeted at cutting off the main port city of Bandar Abbas from the heart of the Islamic Republic entirely. If you've made it this far, drop a comment telling me whether you think this bridge-cutting strategy represents a genuine, deliberate effort to fully isolate Bandar Abbas from the rest of Iran, or whether you read it as a broader, more incidental extension of the existing campaign against Iran's shipping and military logistics infrastructure generally. I want to hear how you're interpreting this specific strategic shift, because reasonable analysts genuinely read this differently. Let's talk about the diplomatic backdrop this entire bridge campaign was unfolding against, because it adds a genuinely interesting layer of context to why this specific strategy might have been chosen at exactly this moment. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters directly, in the same window this bridge campaign was unfolding, that Iran wants to, in her words, make a deal with us, characterizing the American strikes themselves as a direct response to Iran firing on commercial vessels transiting the strait. Trump separately hailed what he described as a goodwill gesture from Iran, connected to the release of an American citizen who had been imprisoned inside the country since 2024. A White House official confirmed to NBC News that this individual, Dina Karari, was safely out of Iran and would be returning home in the coming days. Notice the genuinely strange juxtaposition sitting inside that specific window of time. American forces were actively collapsing control towers, striking residential neighborhoods, and systematically targeting the bridges connecting Iran's most important port to its own capital. At the exact same moment, the White House was publicly describing Iran as wanting to make a deal and celebrating a goodwill gesture connected to a prisoner release. That's not necessarily contradictory. Wars and diplomacy have run in parallel throughout this entire conflict, as we've discussed on this channel before, but it does tell you that even the most aggressive, most strategically significant expansion of this specific campaign, the deliberate isolation of Bandar Abbas, was unfolding directly alongside genuine diplomatic engagement rather than replacing it entirely. Subscribe now, because there's an extremely fresh development from just the past hour that adds a genuinely important, honest counterpoint to everything we've walked through so far tonight. Here's the detail I want to be completely transparent with you about, because responsible coverage of this story requires including it directly, rather than only emphasizing the escalatory pattern we've spent most of this video walking through. According to live reporting from CBS News, updated within just the past hour, the United States has now paused strikes against Iran for a second consecutive night, with talks between the two sides reportedly moving in what's being described as a positive direction. Iran's state broadcaster IRIB separately confirmed that the most recent wave of American missile strikes before this current pause began had struck Avaz, Bandar Abbas, Omidyeh, Keshem, and Andameshk, a target list that reinforces just how consistently Bandar Abbas has continued appearing on these lists across essentially every single wave of this ongoing campaign. But that same reporting includes a detail that connects directly back to something we discussed on this channel in an earlier video, and it deserves genuine attention here as well. According to U.S. military and intelligence officials speaking to CBS News, the rapid pace at which the United States is expending some of its most advanced air defense interceptors and precision-guided weapons across the Middle East theater has become, in their own words, a point of great tension inside the Trump administration, as the broader war with Iran continues ratcheting up again. That's a genuinely significant sourced confirmation from multiple officials that the exact stockpile concern we've tracked across this war's recent development is not a single isolated incident, but an ongoing escalating source of internal friction, shaping how this administration is actually approaching its continued military options. Here's what that specific detail tells you about the current pause in strikes, including whatever pause is currently affecting the Bandar Abbas campaign specifically. It's genuinely possible, and arguably likely, that this current pause reflects some combination of both factors simultaneously: genuine diplomatic progress creating a real incentive to hold off on further strikes, and genuine internal concern about resource depletion creating a parallel independent incentive to slow the pace of an extremely intensive, sustained military campaign that's now been running for months. Those two explanations aren't mutually exclusive. They could both be true at the exact same time, each reinforcing the other's logic for why a pause makes sense right now, regardless of which factor is ultimately weighing more heavily on the actual decision-making happening inside the administration. There's an additional dimension to this exact same reporting window that deserves direct mention, because it adds a genuinely important separate escalatory thread running parallel to everything else we've discussed tonight. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated publicly that Ukraine had achieved what he described as very strong results with long-range strikes in the Caspian Sea, specifically targeting vessels used in military cargo shipments connected to Iran. Zelensky separately said he intends to share evidence directly with the United States, showing that Russia is actively assisting Iran in targeting American bases across the Middle East through satellite surveillance, stating that since the beginning of July specifically, Ukraine has recorded active Russian satellite surveillance activity focused on the Gulf states and American positions in the region. That's a genuinely significant claim, if accurate, because it suggests a third major power, Russia, may be providing direct intelligence support to Iran's own targeting capability against American forces, a dimension of this conflict that extends well beyond the bilateral American-Iranian confrontation this channel has primarily focused on throughout our coverage. Zelensky's own framing of this specific claim was direct and pointed. "None of us in the world should turn a blind eye to one very simple fact," he said. "Evil always seeks ways to make things worse and spread further. Russia must be stopped. This war must be stopped. Pressure on the aggressor must work." Let's talk about why Bandar Abbas specifically has remained such a persistent target across essentially this entire war, because understanding the city's actual strategic function explains exactly why it keeps appearing on strike lists again and again, regardless of how much punishment it's already absorbed. Bandar Abbas serves as the capital of Hormozgan province, and it occupies one of the single most strategically significant positions along the entire length of the Strait of Hormuz. The port functions as the headquarters of the Iranian Navy itself, not simply one naval facility among many, but the actual operational command center for Iran's entire naval force structure. That specific function explains exactly why this city has remained such a consistent target throughout nearly every single distinct phase of this war, from the earliest strikes back in March, through the current, most recent wave of attacks just days ago. You cannot degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the stated core objective behind nearly every wave of American strikes across this entire conflict, without repeatedly, persistently targeting the exact city that houses the command structure for the entire naval force responsible for exactly that threat. Here's the detail that's worth remembering from even earlier in this war's timeline, because it adds important historical context to how seriously Iran itself has previously treated threats to close the Strait of Hormuz from this exact location. Back during that original March wave of strikes, Iran's Revolutionary Guard commander publicly declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, according to reporting from the Times of Israel at the time, with Iran explicitly threatening it would set fire to any vessel attempting to pass through. But a senior American military official pushed back directly against that specific claim, telling Fox News that Iran was neither patrolling nor actively enforcing its own claimed closure, and that there was no evidence whatsoever of mines having actually been placed anywhere in the waterway. That same official specifically characterized the closure announcement as a pressure tactic intended to stoke fear rather than reflecting genuine enforced operational reality, adding that Tehran was considered unlikely to actually mine the waterway, given that roughly 80% of Iran's own oil exports are shipped specifically to China, a detail that reveals Iran's own genuine economic self-interest in keeping the strait functionally open, regardless of whatever rhetorical threats its own officials continue making publicly. That specific historical detail matters enormously for understanding the broader pattern running throughout this entire conflict. Iran has repeatedly demonstrated a consistent gap between its most aggressive public rhetoric and its actual, on-the-ground military behavior, a pattern that shows up again and again across multiple separate phases of this war. And Bandar Abbas itself represents almost the perfect physical embodiment of that exact gap, a city Iran has publicly, repeatedly described as its untouchable naval stronghold, that has nonetheless been struck repeatedly across essentially every single major wave of this entire conflict, from March all the way through this past week. Let's talk about what comes next, because I want to give you something concrete to watch rather than simply leaving you with a historical recap of everything that's already happened. First, watch whether the current pause in strikes, now confirmed for a second consecutive night according to the most recent reporting, actually holds and extends further, or whether Bandar Abbas specifically returns to the target list once this pause eventually ends. Given the city's consistent, repeated appearance across nearly every single previous wave of this war, its continued absence or reappearance on any future strike list will tell you a great deal about whether the underlying strategic logic driving this entire campaign, degrading Iran's naval capability specifically at its own operational headquarters, has genuinely shifted, or whether this current pause simply reflects a temporary operational lull before the exact same pattern resumes. Second, watch whether the specific bridge-cutting strategy around Bandar Abbas continues expanding toward the kind of complete isolation the earlier reporting suggested remained genuinely possible. Right now, other routes connecting the city to the rest of the country reportedly remain open. If future reporting confirms those remaining routes have also been targeted, that would represent a significant escalation from degrading Iran's naval capability specifically toward a considerably more comprehensive strategy aimed at isolating an entire city and its surrounding province from the rest of the nation entirely. Third, and this is the detail I think matters most given everything we've walked through tonight, watch whether Zelensky's specific claims about Russian satellite intelligence, support for Iranian targeting receive any additional confirmation or pushback from American officials in the coming days. If that specific claim gains additional corroboration, it would represent a genuinely significant expansion, and how this entire conflict should be understood, not simply as a bilateral confrontation between Washington and Tehran, but as a conflict where Russia may be providing direct, active intelligence support specifically designed to help Iran threaten American forces and interests across the broader region. There's a human dimension underneath all of this strategic analysis that deserves genuine attention before we close this out. Real people live inside Bandar Abbas, a city of hundreds of thousands of residents, the overwhelming majority of whom have no direct connection whatsoever to the Iranian Navy's command structure or the broader strategic calculations driving why this specific location keeps appearing on strike lists again and again. The 2 people wounded in this week's strike on the Tappeh Allah Akbar neighborhood are real residents of a real neighborhood, caught inside a war being fought over naval headquarters and bridge infrastructure that happens to be located inside the same city where they live their ordinary daily lives. Every single strike we've walked through tonight, going back to those first fires in March, carries that same underlying human reality, regardless of how much the broader strategic conversation focuses on ports, bridges, and naval capability instead. Let's bring this together and look at the complete picture as it stands tonight. Because the honest version of this story requires holding several specific facts together rather than reducing it to a single dramatic headline about one city's supposed vulnerability. What is confirmed? Bandar Abbas, the headquarters of the Iranian Navy and the capital of Hormozgan province, has been struck repeatedly across nearly every major phase of this war, beginning with confirmed fires at its naval headquarters back in March, continuing through a significant strike roughly a week ago following the deaths of 3 American soldiers, and most recently, just 3 days ago, with a direct strike on the Tappeh Allah Akbar residential neighborhood that wounded 2 people, according to Iranian state media. The strategy behind these strikes has genuinely evolved over time, expanding beyond direct hits on naval and port infrastructure toward a deliberate campaign specifically targeting the highway and railway bridges connecting Bandar Abbas to Tehran, an effort explicitly described in reporting as aimed at isolating the city from the rest of the country, while Iran has separately confirmed, for the first time, direct attacks on power infrastructure connected to this same broader campaign. This entire pattern has unfolded alongside genuine parallel diplomatic engagement throughout, including the recent release of an American citizen the White House described as a goodwill gesture from Iran. And, as of the past hour, the United States has paused strikes against Iran for a second consecutive night, with talks reportedly moving in a positive direction, even as U.S. military and intelligence officials confirm genuine internal tension over the pace at which advanced interceptors and precision-guided weapons continue being expended across this entire theater of operations. What remains genuinely uncertain is whether this current pause represents a meaningful, lasting shift in the underlying strategic calculus that has kept Bandar Abbas on essentially every major strike list throughout this entire conflict, or whether it simply reflects a temporary operational lull before the same well-established pattern eventually resumes. Zelensky's specific claims about Russian satellite intelligence support for Iranian targeting add a genuinely significant, still developing dimension to this broader story, one that extends well beyond the primarily bilateral framing that has defined most coverage of this war up to this point. That's the honest state of this story as of tonight. Not a single isolated demonstration that Bandar Abbas was never actually safe, but a sustained, nearly 5-month pattern proving exactly that point, again and again, across essentially every major wave of this entire conflict. A city that functions as the operational headquarters for Iran's entire navy, repeatedly struck, repeatedly rebuilding, repeatedly returning to the target list, while the actual strategy being used against it has quietly, methodically evolved from direct military strikes toward a considerably more comprehensive effort to isolate the entire city from the nation surrounding it. The question I want to leave you with tonight is this: Iran kept its naval fleet concentrated at Bandar Abbas, even after watching its own headquarters catch fire on live satellite imagery back in March, a decision that reflected genuine confidence that this specific location remained too strategically important to abandon, regardless of the risk. Nearly 5 months and multiple separate waves of strikes later, with bridges cut, a control tower collapsed at a neighboring port, and residential neighborhoods now directly hit, that original strategic bet looks considerably less like confidence and considerably more like a decision Iran has simply had no realistic alternative to. So the real question isn't really whether Bandar Abbas can be reached. That question was answered definitively back in March, and reconfirmed repeatedly ever since. The real question is what Iran's own naval command is actually planning to do next, now that the single location its entire fleet has depended on for its operational identity has been proven repeatedly, conclusively, to never have been safe at all. If this breakdown gave you the complete picture of what's actually happened to this specific city across this entire war, share it with someone who's only been catching individual headlines about Bandar Abbas without understanding the full, sustained pattern behind them. Subscribe, because based on everything we've walked through tonight, this is very unlikely to be the last chapter in this specific city's story. I'll be back the moment there's something new to report.